Maple Hollow, Ohio, was the kind of town that seemed immune to time. Its streets were lined with sycamores that whispered in the wind. Its church bell still rang on Sundays, and its people trusted the quiet more than they trusted strangers. But at the edge of that quiet stood a house that didn't seem to belong, a 3-story structure of weathered wood and sagging charm. Mrs. Adler's rest home for travelers, they called it. In the daylight, it was all kindness, a porch swing, fresh bread cooling by the window, a sign promising warm meals and a gentle night's sleep. By lantern light, it was something else entirely. The shutters never opened after dusk, and the smell of cooking lingered long after the fires were out. The year was 1908, a time when railways still carved through America's Midlands like veins of ambition, carrying dreamers, drifters, and those seeking reinvention. Mrs. Adler welcomed them all. She was said to have a smile that felt like forgiveness and eyes that seemed to know too much. Her guests described her dinners as heavenly, rich stews, soft bread, and a kindness that made weary travelers forget the world beyond the valley. But by winter's end, 16 names vanished from the ledgers. 16 souls never reached their destinations. It began with whispers, a suitcase left behind at the station, a horse wandering home without its rider. Locals noticed the ground around the boarding house darkening, the flower beds blooming out of season. Some said the soil was blessed. Others said it was fed. The sheriff sent letters to neighboring towns, but no one came forward to claim the missing. When investigators finally visited, they found the kitchen scrubbed spotless, the floors reeking faintly of iron and soap. Mrs. Adler stood in her apron, hands folded, calm as prayer. She told them she knew nothing. They believed her. The papers called it America's first house of hospitality murders, but even that title felt inadequate. The story grew like ivy, slow, persistent, impossible to uproot. Some painted Mrs. Adler as a lonely widow driven mad by grief, others as a calculating predator who understood the value of trust. Decades later, psychologists would dissect her legend as a study in cognitive dissonance, the duality of nurture and destruction, the line between care and consumption. To the villagers, though, it was simpler. They called her cursed. More than a century later, the boarding house is gone, burned down in a fire no one saw start. Yet the field where it once stood remains bare, untouched by crops or cattle. Travelers who stop along the old railway say that when fog rolls in from the river, it smells of thyme and meat broth. And if you linger too long, you might hear a woman's voice humming from nowhere, low, steady, and unbearably kind. Some claim it's the ghost of mercy itself, still feeding the hungry. Others believe it's hunger that never learned to die. In the heart of Maple Hollow, Ohio, where the fog drifts low over the cornfields and the nights taste faintly of rust, there once stood a farmhouse that locals called the Widow's Rest. In 1908, it was already a relic, its white paint curling like old parchment, its windows staring blankly into the woods beyond. Its owner, Margaret Adler, was a woman both admired and pitied, a widow in her 50s who spoke softly, smiled rarely, and kept her grief folded neatly like linens. After her husband, Thomas Adler, died in 1905 of what the coroner called heart paralysis, she was left with a mortgage, unpaid debts, and a loneliness that settled into her bones. She had no children, though she'd lost 3 in childbirth, and neighbors often said the silence of her home sounded heavier than mourning. To survive, she converted the farmhouse into a boarding house for travelers, peddlers, farmhands, and weary preachers passing through. She called it Mrs. Adler's Rest Home for Travelers, but most just called it the Widow's House. At first it was a sanctuary. She baked fresh bread every morning, her garden overflowed with herbs, and the smell of her cooking carried all the way to the church steps. Those who stayed spoke of her kindness, her willingness to listen, and her strange but gentle manner. She had a way of speaking as though reading from scripture, her words slow, measured, final. In her parlor hung a portrait of her husband beside a wooden cross, both draped in black cloth. Some said she never moved the chair where he used to sit. Others swore she spoke to it at night. Yet, for all her gentleness, there was something about her that unsettled people. A farmer's wife once remarked that Mrs. Adler's eyes seemed to watch and weigh, as though measuring a person's soul rather than their face. But Maple Hollow was a God-fearing place, and pity was often mistaken for grace. The widow's hospitality became the town's pride, until the first disappearance. The man was a traveling preacher named Reverend Colby, last seen blessing his supper at Mrs. Adler's table one stormy evening in late autumn. He had told the townsfolk that he planned to reach the next parish by morning. but his horse was later found tied to a post near the boarding house, reins soaked in rain. When the sheriff questioned Mrs. Adler, she said the preacher had left after midnight, thanking her for a meal that would keep him warm through Judgment Day. No one doubted her. But 2 weeks later, another guest vanished, a watch salesman named Harlan Brooks. His suitcase was found under the bed he'd slept in, untouched. Then came a migrant worker, then a tinker, then a schoolteacher traveling west. By the fifth disappearance, whispers had begun to fill the pews on Sunday mornings. People said the soil in Mrs. Adler's garden looked too dark, too soft, and that she was seen digging in the moonlight. Others claimed they saw smoke rising from her chimney at odd hours and smelled something that wasn't quite wood or bread, something faintly metallic. The sheriff dismissed it as gossip. Maple Hollow had little appetite for scandal, especially one that threatened its reputation for Christian charity. A widow so devout could never harm a soul, the preacher declared. And that settled it for a while. But truth in Maple Hollow was like mold beneath the floorboards, silent, spreading, waiting for the right humidity to breathe. In spring, when the snow melted, dogs began unearthing strange things in the Adler garden. Buttons, scraps of cloth, a rusted wedding ring, and once, something small and pale mistaken at first for a root. Mrs. Adler scolded the animals gently, buried the soil again, and returned to baking. The town, uncomfortable with its own suspicions, turned its attention elsewhere. After all, her charm was disarming. She sang hymns at dawn, hosted prayer circles, and wept during every sermon about forgiveness. Yet the air around her house felt wrong, the kind of wrong that hides beneath cleanliness and prayer. When visitors entered, they noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet, except for the faint hum from the cellar, where she said she stored her flour. Sometimes, she claimed, she could hear her husband's voice echo down there, telling her that love never dies, it just changes form. By 1907, the boarding house had become both sanctuary and specter. Travelers continued to arrive, drawn by its cheap rates and good meals, unaware that none who stayed more than 2 nights were ever seen again. The townspeople justified each new absence. Maybe the men ran off, maybe they found better work, maybe they simply wanted to disappear. It was easier to believe in coincidence than in evil with kind eyes. But one man, a mill worker named Elias Boone, grew suspicious after his brother failed to return from a stay at the widow's house. He rode into town demanding answers, only to find Mrs. Adler waiting on her porch, smiling, apron spotless, eyes glistening with tears. "Your brother was a good man," she said softly. "He found peace." Elias never found a body, but a week later, his horse was discovered grazing outside the boarding house gate. Elias himself was never seen again. That was when the sheriff could no longer ignore the rumors. He searched the property, found nothing but freshly turned soil and the scent of yeast thick in the air. When he asked about the garden, Mrs. Adler replied, "Every seed needs burying to bloom." It was the perfect line, biblical, haunting, impossible to challenge. Even so, something shifted after that day. The townsfolk avoided her road. Children whispered that the house was hungry. Some claimed to see faces in the window at night, blurred, blue-tinged, watching. A traveling photographer once tried to capture the house for a newspaper story. When he developed the image, he swore the window panes reflected dozens of silhouettes that hadn't been there. He burned the photograph. Meanwhile, Mrs. Adler carried on as if nothing had changed. She planted new roses. She baked daily bread. And she prayed longer than anyone else. When asked why she always smelled faintly of smoke, she said it was from the stove, a hard thing to keep burning when you're alone. Historians looking back on those years often call them the quiet season, when fear became routine, and the widow's house turned from gossip into legend. The contrast was unbearable, a woman revered for her gentleness, possibly hiding unimaginable cruelty beneath her calm. Some psychologists later described her as an early case of compassion fatigue, a psyche fractured by grief and isolation until kindness curdled into obsession. But others see something deeper, an ancient hunger disguised as mercy. It's said that in her final months, she began inviting guests to pray before eating, asking them to repeat after her, "May this meal join us in body and in spirit." Locals dismissed it as eccentricity. They didn't realize she meant it literally. When the disappearances finally drew attention from the state authorities in 1908, investigators found the boarding house empty. Plates still sat on the dining table, bread half-cut, chairs slightly pulled back as if their occupants had just risen. The stove was warm. The air was heavy with the smell of stew. In the cellar, they found dozens of sealed jars labeled with Bible verses, each containing what appeared to be rendered fat. The sheriff fainted. Reporters came from Cincinnati, from Chicago, from as far as New York, calling it the house that fed guests into the night. They expected to find a deranged butcher, a witch, a cult leader. But Mrs. Adler was gone. Only her ledger remained, its pages filled with names and dates, and next to the last entry, a short phrase written in careful cursive, "All debts repaid." The investigation yielded no conclusive evidence. No bodies were found, only disturbed soil and traces of something organic burned into the earth. Some said she fled west. Others claimed she drowned herself in the Maple River, her apron found tangled in reeds. The town sealed the house and tried to forget. But forgetting is never clean. In the years that followed, travelers passing through Maple Hollow reported strange occurrences. Lights flickering inside the abandoned farmhouse, smoke rising from the chimney though the hearth had collapsed, and on cold nights, the unmistakable aroma of baking bread carried on the wind. A few brave souls who ventured close described hearing what sounded like humming. A woman's voice, low and rhythmic, as if stirring something unseen. When asked what they thought she was singing, one man said, "It sounded like grace." To this day, historians debate whether Margaret Adler was a serial murderer or a tragic figure driven mad by grief. Psychologists describe her as a case study in repression, a woman who fed others to fill the emptiness inside herself. Theologians call her story a cautionary parable of divine inversion, where the sacred act of feeding becomes the profane act of consumption. And folklorists see in her tale echoes of older legends, the cannibal innkeepers of France, the soul-feeding spirits of Appalachia, the hungry saints of early Christian myth. Every generation reshapes her image to fit its fears. Yet one detail remains constant, the smell of bread that accompanies every telling, as if her memory itself continues to bake, warm and relentless, somewhere beyond time. Even now, more than a century later, the foundations of the widow's house lie buried beneath ivy and moss, but locals still refuse to build there. They say the earth remembers. Each spring the soil turns soft again, rich and red, as though something beneath still hungers. Some claim that flowers planted near the site bloom blood dark and wilt by dusk. Others insist that when storms come, the rain over Maple Hollow tastes faintly of salt and ash. Perhaps it's coincidence, perhaps it's remembrance. But in a town that prays before every meal and locks its doors before sundown, the name Mrs. Adler is no longer spoken aloud. It lingers instead in whispers, in the hush between thunder and grace, in the quiet dread that sometimes follows the scent of something cooking when no one is home. And in that silence the question still lingers. Was she the mourner or the monster? The savior who fed the lost, or the hand that served them to the dark? No one knows. No one ever will. Between 1907 and 1908, the widow's house in Maple Hollow became a revolving door of arrivals and disappearances, a quiet rhythm of footsteps that entered but never left. 16 men in total, traveling preachers, peddlers, laborers, and drifters, checked into Mrs. Adler's rest home for travelers and were never seen again. The town ledger kept their names. Their trunks remained untouched, their horses still tethered outside, reins stiff with frost. Every time someone asked what had happened, Mrs. Adler would offer the same gentle answer. They paid, they ate, they left. Her calmness made it impossible to argue. She was, after all, the widow everyone pitied, the woman who hosted prayer circles, baked for funerals, and donated bread to the poor. But by the time the 12th man went missing, even pity began to rot into doubt. The town's gossip sharpened into fear. Farmers claimed they saw a strange glow in her kitchen window late at night, as if firelight flickered in patterns rather than flames. Children said they heard humming from beneath the floorboards when they passed by, and still, no one confronted her. Maple Hollow had long believed that evil was something that came from the outside, from strangers, vagrants, men who drank or cursed, not from someone who knew every verse of the gospel by heart. The guest book became the first real sign that something was wrong. It was kept on the hallway table near the front door, a thick leather-bound ledger where travelers would sign their names, occupations, and destinations. But over time, the handwriting changed. Early entries were neat and formal, the kind of careful cursive one would expect from educated men. Later entries grew erratic, childlike, or oddly identical. Certain pages appeared torn out entirely, as though someone had tried to erase particular stays. Sheriff Holloway, who'd grown up 3 farms over, noticed that the ink on some pages bled fresh, while older signatures seemed pressed rather than written, as if copied by hand. When he asked Mrs. Adler about it, she smiled softly and said, "Men forget their names more often than you'd think." It was an answer that said nothing and everything. The following week, another traveler vanished, a sewing machine salesman named Dent, but unlike the others, he came back. Elias Dent was the only man known to have survived the widow's house. His testimony, though scattered and inconsistent, would later become the foundation of every theory about the Maple Hollow disappearances. According to his statement to the Ohio Bureau of Investigation, Dent had arrived on a rainy evening in February 1908. The house, he said, smelled faintly of lavender and lard. Mrs. Adler greeted him in her nightgown, her hair pinned neatly beneath a black lace bonnet, as if she'd been waiting. She served him stew thick with potatoes and something she called Sunday meat, which he assumed was pork. That night, unable to sleep, he heard noises from the kitchen, meat grinding, the scrape of metal, and a soft, rhythmic humming. It wasn't a hymn, he said, but an old German lullaby. Schlaf, Kindlein, schlaf. When he crept to the hallway and peered through the keyhole, he saw Mrs. Adler standing barefoot before the stove, stirring a large pot with her bare hands. Her skin glistened, her mouth moved in what he described as a language older than English, and behind her hung slabs of something pale from hooks, swinging gently. Terrified, he fled before dawn, leaving his suitcase behind. He arrived at the next township incoherent, shaking and half-starved, claiming that the widow feeds the dead. Authorities dismissed him as delirious, yet within a month another 3 guests disappeared. The eventual search of the property was conducted quietly, partly to avoid panic, partly to protect reputations. Sheriff Holloway led 2 deputies and a coroner to the boarding house under the pretense of collecting tax records. What they found beneath the kitchen changed Maple Hollow forever. Behind the pantry wall, hidden by a false panel, was a narrow passage leading to a cellar. Inside, the air was damp and sweet, thick with the smell of iron. There were tools, cleavers, hooks, bone saws, and a long wooden table etched with symbols resembling runes. Along the walls stood shelves lined with jars, each labeled with scripture verses, Matthew 26:26, John 6:51, Exodus 12:8. Some jars contained what appeared to be herbs, others a dark gelatinous substance that investigators could not identify, and yet no human remains were ever found. Not a single bone. The cellar floor was packed earth, dark and wet. When they dug, they found only ash. Word spread fast, faster than the sheriff could contain it. Reporters from Cincinnati and Cleveland descended on the town, calling it the Cannibal House of Ohio. But Mrs. Adler was already gone. No one had seen her since the night before the search. The local paper described her disappearance as a vanishing of biblical irony, the devout consumed by her own sin. Some believed she'd drowned herself in the Maple River. Others claimed she'd fled west under a false name. A few whispered that she was still inside the house, somewhere the living couldn't reach. It was then that the stories began to twist, merging fact with folklore. Farmers claimed the soil in her yard was too soft, as if it had been tilled from beneath. One woman swore she saw something rise from the ground after rain, something white, like a hand, before it sank again. Years later, forensic analysts revisiting the evidence found traces of calcium and phosphorus in the soil, consistent with decomposed bone, but not enough to account for 16 bodies. Theories multiplied. Some said she ground the remains into her bread, feeding guests with the very men who came before them. Others suggested the runes carved into the table were part of an alchemical ritual, a desperate attempt to preserve life through flesh. A priest who examined the cellar claimed the symbols were protective, not profane, designed to bind spirits rather than summon them. But if she meant to protect anyone, it was unclear whom. Psychologists studying the case in the 1950s coined a term from her story, the empathy paradox. It described a condition where extreme compassion becomes indistinguishable from cruelty, a caretaker so consumed by the need to nurture that she devours what she loves. In Margaret Adler's case, they said, grief may have distorted her sense of mercy. Feeding, for her, could have been both an act of love and of control, a way to preserve companionship in the only way she understood. To make sure no one ever left her again. It's a chilling theory, but one supported by fragments of her personal letters discovered decades later in the attic of a church rectory. In them she wrote, "I cannot bear to bury another. I keep them with me, in warmth, in bread, in body." Scholars still debate whether the letters are genuine or forged, but their handwriting matches the entries in her guest book. There's another detail the early investigators overlooked or perhaps suppressed. Among the items in the cellar was a small wooden cross, carved crudely and stained dark. Beneath it, etched into the wood of the table, was a phrase in German, Fleisch ist Erlösung, flesh is salvation. This discovery led to a second wave of theories suggesting her acts were not random, but ritualistic. Folklorists connected it to old Rhineland burial customs, brought to America by German settlers in the 1800s, in which bread baked with bone ash was believed to seal a soul for the afterlife. If true, Mrs. Adler might have seen herself not as a murderer, but as a deliverer, a baker of redemption, feeding the lost into eternity. But perhaps the most unsettling detail came not from the cellar, but from the dining room. When the sheriff's men photographed the table, they noticed something in the grain of the wood, a faint pattern, circular, as if etched by heat. When enhanced, it resembled a human face, eyes closed, lips parted. The photo was dismissed as a trick of the light, yet the original print was later found missing from police archives. A surviving copy surfaced in 1983 among the possessions of a retired deputy. When he was asked why he'd kept it, he said, "Because it still smells like bread." The vanishing guests became more than a crime. It became a mirror held to human nature itself. Some saw Mrs. Adler as a monster, proof that evil can hide behind kindness. Others saw her as a victim of a world that had no place for women's grief, a society that worshipped gentleness but ignored despair. To this day, her story divides believers and skeptics alike. For every theory grounded in science, chemical contamination, ergot poisoning, delusion, there is another rooted in faith, in folklore, in hunger. Perhaps she believed she was feeding souls to heaven. Perhaps she simply fed her loneliness. Or perhaps she discovered what every myth has warned us since the dawn of time, that creation and consumption are two sides of the same sin. By 1910, the widow's house was condemned. Its windows were nailed shut, its doors chained, and its land sold at auction. Yet no buyer ever took possession. Each attempt to clear the property failed. Workers fell ill, tools went missing, fires broke out without cause. The last man hired to demolish the house claimed that when he struck the first beam, a voice whispered behind him, "Not yet." He quit that same night. The house stood for decades after, sinking slowly into the earth until only the chimney remained. And even now, when the wind shifts across the old lot, people say you can still hear humming from beneath the soil, soft, measured, almost tender, like a woman singing a lullaby to what she has fed. When word of the disappearances reached the diocese in Cincinnati, Father Alaric Voss was already known as something of an oddity among priests, part theologian, part folklorist, and part skeptic of both. He had studied rural superstitions across Bavaria and Prussia before immigrating to America in 1899, publishing essays on peasant piety and its survival in immigrant enclaves. When he heard whispers that a widow in Ohio might have practiced a ritual known as Die Speisende Hand, the feeding hand, he took the first train to Maple Hollow. To the local authorities, he presented himself as a representative of the church's moral interest. Privately, he was driven by a fascination with what he called the collision between hunger and holiness. His arrival caused a stir. Dressed in his black cassock and traveling with a suitcase full of old German prayer books, he looked more like an undertaker than a priest. Yet his manner was gentle, curious, persuasive. He spent his first week interviewing townsfolk, collecting fragments of gossip, scripture, and song. He noted how everyone described Mrs. Adler the same way: generous, clean, devout, incapable of cruelty. That, he wrote in his journal, was precisely what frightened him. Evil rarely looks like hatred, he wrote. More often it looks like service offered too willingly. Father Voss spent hours inside the Adler property, long after the sheriff's men had sealed it. He claimed that when he first entered the kitchen he felt no dread, only warmth, like walking into the memory of a meal. The smell of iron still hung in the air. He found in the pantry a series of letters wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath a jar of lard. The letters, written in German and dated between 1903 and 1907, were addressed to Herr Dr. Eberhard in Augsburg. Their contents were chilling. In them, Mrs. Adler wrote of dreams in which her late husband sat at the table, pale and silent, refusing to eat until she fed him the living. One letter described her conviction that by mixing flesh into food, she could sustain the wandering soul. Another referenced the binding of the dead to bread, the ton. Apothecary's replies, though few, encouraged her studies in what he called corporeal devotion, a hybrid of alchemy and rural Catholic mysticism that sought to unify body and spirit through consumption. To Father Voss, this was more than madness. It was liturgy gone feral. When he presented his findings to the sheriff, the reaction was disbelief. Holloway dismissed the letters as fabrications or misunderstandings. "We're not chasing ghosts," he said. "We're chasing a woman." But the priest pressed on. He explained that in certain Bavarian villages, Die Speisende Hand was whispered as a forbidden funeral rite. The legend held that when grief threatened to destroy a widow's sanity, she could feed the dead by preparing a meal mixed with a token of their remains. A tooth, a lock of hair, a piece of ash. If the offering was accepted, the spirit would remain near, blessing the house and its hearth. If rejected, it would curse the home until the living joined it. Voss argued that Mrs. Adler, cut off from her homeland and stricken with grief, might have interpreted this legend literally, attempting to anchor her dead husband's soul through ritual feeding. The sheriff called it foreign nonsense, but privately he confessed to his deputy that the story made more sense than any he'd heard. As the investigation deepened, science and superstition began to intertwine. Local farmers told of fog that gathered around the boarding house like smoke, of livestock dying after drinking from its well, of hens that laid blood-speckled eggs. One boy, trembling under oath, claimed he saw faces boiling in the soup pot through the kitchen window. His testimony was dismissed as hysteria, yet the description matched a story from German folklore in which damned souls appeared as bubbles in cursed broth. Reporters embellished every word, turning Maple Hollow into a carnival of speculation. The Cleveland Plain Dealer called the widow Ohio's Witch of the Furnace, while the Boston Evening Transcript published a serialized account titled The Cannibal Widow of the Midwest. Beneath the sensationalism, though, something deeper was taking shape. A question about how faith could mutate when left alone in the dark. The furnace became the final focus of Father Voss's study. Buried beneath layers of soot and rust, it seemed unremarkable at first. Yet when the sheriff ordered it opened, what they found turned disbelief into silence. Inside lay blackened fragments of bone, hundreds of them, too small for cattle but too many to belong to a single person. The coroner noted that several appeared to have been deliberately filed down, as if shaped for grinding. Mixed among them were objects unfit for the fire: a rosary fused into a lump of metal, a child's hair ribbon, the handle of a cooking spoon. The sheriff's official report called them animal remains. Father Voss called them proof. He argued that Mrs. Adler had used the furnace not merely to destroy evidence but to complete a ritual of transmutation, converting flesh to ash, ash to sustenance, sustenance to spirit. To him, this was the physical enactment of her correspondence with the apothecary, a sacrament of despair. When he spoke these words aloud at the town meeting, he was met with outrage. The citizens of Maple Hollow, who had once pitied the widow, now feared what her story implied about themselves. If her acts were born of faith, then their own hymns might not be so far from her chants. If her kitchen was a chapel, then their tables might not be innocent either. That night, someone threw a stone through the church window, shattering the crucifix above the altar. The priest took it as a sign. In his diary he wrote, "We have all eaten from her hand." Over the next months, academic journals attempted to dismantle his claims. The American Journal of Psychiatry dismissed the idea of ritual feeding as cultural hysteria. The Ohio Medical Review argued that the disappearances could be explained by robbery, poisons, or the delusions of a grieving mind. Yet none could explain the soil samples taken from the property, which showed abnormally high nitrogen content, nor the jars labeled with biblical verses found intact in the cellar. One chemist examining the residue inside noted the presence of alkaloids consistent with Claviceps purpurea, ergot fungus, the same hallucinogen that once poisoned medieval villages and inspired the earliest witchcraft trials. The possibility arose that Mrs. Adler had unknowingly contaminated her bread, causing hallucinations among guests and perhaps herself. But if it was all delusion, how did so many vanish? And why did their belongings remain untouched, their horses unfed, their boots still by the door? Science answered some questions only by raising others. In the decades that followed, the case became a battleground between rationalism and religion. Theologians cited it as evidence of faith's corruption without guidance. Psychologists labeled it a caregiver's psychosis. Folklorists treated it as proof that old European rites had not died in the New World, but merely changed their masks. Meanwhile, the locals clung to their own explanations. They said the soil still breathed. They said that on winter nights, Smoke rose from the collapsed chimney even though the house was gone. Some refused to walk near the ruins after sunset. Others, braver or more foolish, claimed to see footprints in the frost. Bare, feminine, always leading toward the well. Father Voss remained in Maple Hollow until his death in 1919, refusing promotion or transfer. He continued to write, filling notebooks with translations of folk hymns and marginalia on Mrs. Adler's letters. His final entry, found after his passing, read simply, "Mercy becomes monstrous when it forgets the difference between hunger and love." His body was buried in the churchyard beside the burned remains of the old boarding house. A year later, the church roof collapsed in a storm and the parish was abandoned. Modern investigators returned to the site in 1974, armed with new technology and old skepticism. Using ground-penetrating radar, they detected anomalies beneath the foundation, pockets of air, cavities shaped roughly like bodies. Excavation revealed nothing but compacted ash and shards of porcelain. A forensic toxicologist named Dr. Elaine Mercer re-examined the bone fragments preserved in the state archive, confirming the presence of ergot alkaloids, calcium, and trace iron oxides. Her conclusion was cautious. The victims, if they existed, may have suffered hallucinations before death. The perpetrator, if she existed, may have believed she was curing them. In her final report, she added a haunting sentence. Between science and superstition, truth dissolves like steam from an empty pot. Today, the story of the widow of Maple Hollow survives not in textbooks, but in whispered retellings. Paranormal investigators visit the site with recorders, hoping to capture the hum of her lullaby. Historians debate whether the letters were authentic or forged to justify hysteria. Anthropologists trace parallels between her legend and older tales of sacrificial cooking, from the Slavic domovoi offerings to the Greek myths of the Feast of Thyestes. Every retelling transforms her, from murderer to martyr, from blasphemer to believer. And yet, beneath every version lies the same disquieting core. The idea that devotion can ferment. That faith, left too long in isolation, can turn poisonous, like bread left to rise until it collapses under its own weight. Perhaps Mrs. Adler never practiced ritual at all. Perhaps she simply broke under loneliness, mixing faith and hunger until they became one. But if so, why do those who visit her ruins still report the smell of broth when there is no fire? Why do dogs refuse to drink from the old well? Why do strangers claim to hear a woman's voice whisper, "Eat so you may stay"? The rational mind rejects such tales, yet the human heart, hungry for pattern and meaning, continues to feed on them. Thus, the line between religion and folklore, madness and miracle, remains blurred, as it always has. The widow's story endures because it asks not what she did, but what we might do in her place, given the same hunger, the same grief, the same silence from heaven. As Father Voss once wrote, "When God will not answer, the kitchen becomes a chapel." And perhaps that is why her legend refuses to die, because it tastes somehow of truth. Every era finds its monsters, and every generation rediscovers them wearing a different mask. Psychology, in its earnest hunger to humanize, often becomes theology by another name, an attempt to explain evil without invoking the divine. In the case of Mrs. Margaret Adler, the so-called widow of Maple Hollow, experts across the 20th century tried to decide whether she had truly killed 16 men or merely constructed a delusion elaborate enough to swallow them. To some, she was a textbook case of pseudologia fantastica, a mind fractured by grief and loneliness, compelled to invent stories so vivid they replaced memory. To others, she was the embodiment of what modern clinicians would call trauma-induced ritual psychosis, a breakdown of the boundary between belief and reality so complete that self and myth became indistinguishable. What made her unique, however, was not the violence itself, but the way she transfigured it into worship. Her kitchen was her altar, her stove, her confessional. Each act of feeding became an act of atonement. In this sense, Mrs. Adler was less a predator than a priest of her own distorted faith, performing communion in reverse, offering flesh not to God, but to the ghosts he would not take. When the charred remains of her diaries were recovered from the ruins in 1958, scholars expected the ravings of a murderer. What they found instead was a theology written in trembling cursive, pages alternating between scripture, domestic recipes, and fevered confession. One line read, "The Lord feeds me through their eyes." Another, "If I do not serve them, they will serve me." Forensic linguists noted a gradual shift in syntax. as though two distinct voices were speaking through the same pen, one rational, grammatical, seeking forgiveness, the other fragmented, urgent, pleading. Psycholinguistic analysis later confirmed this duality, identifying patterns of dissociation common in trauma survivors who experience their guilt as an external presence. She did not, it seems, see herself as killing men, but as sustaining lost souls through ritualized nourishment. What the outside world called murder, she might have experienced as mercy. Each disappearance, in her perception, was an offering to preserve life, her husband's, her own, perhaps even God's. To interpret these writings, psychologists turn to the concept of symbolic cannibalism, a phenomenon in which the mind consumes guilt by projecting it onto acts of ingestion. It is a psychological echo of an ancient instinct to eat what we fear so that we might control it. In early Catholicism, the Eucharist blurred this line, take, eat. This is my body, a metaphorical act that, when detached from communal context, could easily decay into madness. In Mrs. Adler's solitude, the metaphor became literal. Starved of companionship, she transformed hunger into devotion and food into sacrament. In her world, there was no boundary between feeding and forgiving. The body of another became a vessel for reconciliation. She wrote, "To feed is to save. To starve is to sin." Her theology was grotesque but coherent, a moral system inverted, like a mirror reflecting scripture through the cracks of grief. By the 1970s, clinical studies reframed her behavior within the language of psychosis. Dr. Robert Kessler, a forensic psychiatrist at the Ohio Institute for the Criminally Insane, published a paper titled The Empathy Inversion, Case Study of Margaret Adler, arguing that she suffered from empathetic cannibalism, a state in which compassion exceeds its moral boundary and turns parasitic. She did not kill to harm, he wrote, but to absorb, to keep others within her. Kessler compared her rituals to the myth of Cronus devouring his children, not out of cruelty but fear of abandonment. The hunger, he argued, was not for flesh but for permanence. Each guest represented a transient life, brief, passing, reminding her of the impermanence that had already taken her husband. By consuming them symbolically, she denied loss itself. In that way, Mrs. Adler's story became a psychological parable about grief's appetite, the way sorrow feeds on what it cannot keep. Other scholars challenged Kessler's conclusions, pointing instead to environmental and neurological factors. Exposure to ergot fungus, the same hallucinogen found in the remains, could have induced vivid visual distortions, paranoia, and religious ecstasy. Dr. Elaine Mercer, who led the toxicology re-examination of the site, proposed that chronic exposure might have created a shared delusional system between Mrs. Adler and her guests. A folie à plusieurs, madness distributed among many minds. In such states, reality bends. Collectively, the guests may have experienced the same hallucinations she did, the same spectral presences, the same belief that the food on their plates was more than food. The horror, then, was not that she poisoned them, but that they willingly partook in the ritual, convinced they were eating for redemption. She may not have devoured them, Mercer wrote. So much as persuaded them to vanish. If so, the mystery of their missing bodies might not be murder at all, but migration, a mass psychogenic exodus into oblivion. In the 1990s, the case was resurrected for television. The documentary The Widow's Table aired on the History Channel, presenting Mrs. Adler as a Gothic archetype of female madness, a culinary Medea in calico. Yet amid the dramatization, one moment lingered. During filming, a team of paranormal researchers attempted to record electronic voice phenomena within the remaining foundations of the boarding house. The tape, played during the broadcast, captured faint but distinct syllables, a breath, a hum, and the words, eat and stay. Skeptics dismissed it as radio interference from nearby farms. Believers called it proof. Psychologists called it projection, the human tendency to find meaning where silence lives. But regardless of interpretation, the message resonated. The phrase eat and stay became a cultural echo, printed on t-shirts, whispered in online forums, adopted by artists and musicians as a symbol of hunger that transcends flesh. The fascination with Mrs. Adler endures not because of what she did, but because of what she represents. Her story is a mirror reflecting the psychology of appetite itself, our moral and emotional craving disguised as curiosity. In every retelling, every analysis, every late-night podcast dissecting her case, we perform our own ritual of consumption. We feed upon her tragedy, to reassure ourselves that we are not her. We consume her story so that our own shadows might feel lighter. Horror in this way becomes a form of digestion. It allows us to metabolize fear into fascination. When we watch the documentaries, when we read the transcripts, when we whisper her name into the algorithms of the internet, we continue her ritual, taking in the dead to feel more alive. Cultural theorists have called this phenomenon narrative cannibalism, the transformation of atrocity into entertainment. Yet Mrs. Adler's case resists simplification. Unlike serial killers who sought pleasure or power, her motives dissolve into ambiguity. If she believed she was saving souls, then she occupies a moral space beyond sanity and beyond evil. That ambiguity haunts psychologists because it exposes the limits of their frameworks. Every diagnosis becomes a translation of mystery into manageable language: psychosis, delusion, hysteria. But beneath each term lies the same unspeakable core: hunger. The hunger to make sense, to assign purpose, to feed the void that reason alone cannot fill. In that sense, the study of Mrs. Adler becomes a confession of our own compulsions. We name her to silence her, but in naming we keep her alive. Modern neuroscience offers another lens. Recent studies on mirror neurons, the brain circuits responsible for empathy, suggest that compassion and cruelty may share overlapping pathways. The same neurological response that makes us flinch at another's pain can, under stress or trauma, invert into fascination. In extreme isolation, the boundary between helping and harming blurs. Mrs. Adler's empathy paradox, as Kessler called it, thus becomes not a singular madness, but a universal possibility. The caretaker becomes the devourer, the nurturer becomes the executioner. The instinct to preserve life twists into the compulsion to possess it completely. In her, we see the shadow of every parent who clings too tightly, every lover who confuses devotion with ownership, every believer who feeds faith until it becomes fanaticism. By the time the 21st century arrived, Mrs. Adler had become less a person than a parable. College courses in abnormal psychology use her case to explore the intersection of myth and neurosis. Artists reinterpret her image in paintings, installations, and films, often portraying her surrounded by bowls of steaming bread that never cool. True crime podcasts debate her innocence. Theologians debate her damnation. Each retelling reshapes her, digesting her into a new cultural form. The historian sees a widow crushed by patriarchy. The psychiatrist sees a mind devoured by loss. The folklorist sees an immigrant preserving ancestral ritual. The horror fan sees an icon. None of them are wrong, and yet none of them are entirely right. Truth, like appetite, refuses containment. The real terror of the widow of Maple Hollow lies not in her crimes, but in her reflection of us. She embodies the compulsion to feed on stories of darkness, to consume horror as a means of feeling moral. We dine on tales of depravity to reassure ourselves of our goodness. Each retelling, each analysis is another bite. We read of her rituals with the same hunger she once felt stirring in her own heart, and so even in death she continues to serve. She feeds us with her legend, and we, in turn, keep her alive by consuming it. The appetite becomes mutual. She for absolution, we for understanding. Neither will ever be satisfied. Perhaps that is why the ruins of the Boardinghouse still draw visitors. Not for proof, not for ghosts, but for reflection. Standing there, one senses not horror but empathy twisted upon itself, a recognition that beneath morality and madness lies the same gnawing desire to be remembered, to be needed, to be consumed by meaning. The soil may be silent, but the story is not. It continues to rise like steam, invisible yet warm, whispering the same invitation that Elias Dent once heard before fleeing into the dark. Eat and stay. And so we do. In the decades following the Maple Hollow disappearances, the case of Margaret Adler became less a matter of investigation and more a mirror reflecting whatever each generation most feared. Newspapers, academics, theologians, and amateur ghost hunters all tried to claim her story, shaping it to fit their own narratives. The first theory, what historians call the grain sickness hypothesis, emerged in 1912, when a state chemist studying agricultural contamination proposed that the victims might have suffered ergot poisoning from spoiled rye. He pointed to similar outbreaks in France centuries earlier, where villagers hallucinated demons and tore at their own flesh. The theory painted Mrs. Adler not as a murderer, but as an unwitting agent of natural tragedy, a woman whose guests simply fell victim to invisible spores. Yet this explanation faltered under scrutiny. If the tainted grain was truly to blame, why did she alone survive? Why were there no other poisonings reported in the nearby farms that shared the same harvest? And how did the cellar come to contain tools not used in any kitchen, engraved with symbols that even the chemist admitted resembled intention more than accident? The ergot theory dissolved like yeast in too much water, rational but not satisfying. People wanted a villain or a ghost, not a fungus. The second theory took shape in the 1920s, driven by true crime fascination and a growing appetite for psychological horror. This one cast Mrs. Adler as America's first female serial killer, decades before the term even existed. Investigators reviewing the coroner's reports noticed the same phrase repeated across each disappearance: last seen near the dining table. This, combined with the jars of preserved organs and the rumored confession entries in her diary, painted a portrait of calculated cruelty. Some suggested she lured her victims with sympathy: lonely travelers, widowed men, migrant workers with no families to notice their absence, and dispatched them under the pretense of feeding them. To her, food and flesh blurred into one theology of control. To nourish was to own was to consume. Crime historians compared her to later figures like Belle Gunness of Indiana, noting eerie parallels in method and motive. Yet, unlike Gunness, no remains were ever proven human, no confession was authenticated, and no trial ever took place. The legend persisted precisely because it never concluded. The third theory, the one whispered most often in churches and taverns, wandered beyond reason entirely. It claimed Margaret Adler was the last practitioner of an old Bavarian ritual known as Die Speisende Hand, the feeding hand, a form of ancestral communion in which bread, flesh, and soul were bound into one offering to sustain the dead. The theory gained traction after Father Voss's letters were rediscovered in 1948, describing a woman who mistook resurrection for recipe. In this version, Adler's actions were not crimes but ceremonies, her table an altar, her meals a covenant with something she believed older than God. When the boarding house was finally demolished in 1952, workers unearthed what they first thought to be an urn, a heavy iron pot sealed with wax. Inside was a single blackened loaf, its crust fossilized, its surface carved with initials: E.D. For many, this was proof enough. Elias Dent, the one man said to have escaped her house, had vanished years after his testimony, his body never found. Some claimed Adler had finished her ritual posthumously. Others said the loaf was Dent himself, transformed into offering. The artifact was sent to the Cincinnati Historical Museum for study, where 2 curators assigned to catalog it died within a year. The first from severe food poisoning after a dinner party, the second from carbon monoxide inhalation in his home. Neither death was officially connected to the artifact, but rumors spread quickly. Staff refused to handle it. The pot was sealed in storage. The records marked archival hazard, and the basement wing containing it was quietly shut down by the late 1960s. When journalists tried to access it decades later, the paperwork had vanished. The museum denied it was ever received. Still, photographs of the pot circulate on obscure internet forums, grainy, indistinct, always accompanied by claims of flickering lights or distorted audio whenever viewed too long. Paranormal investigators who visited the remains of the boarding house report electromagnetic interference, erratic heartbeats, nausea, and in some cases, the scent of broth appearing without a source. Scientists attribute these experiences to suggestion, mold spores, and carbon monoxide seepage from the underground aquifers. But believers point to something deeper, that what Adler began was never meant to end, that her kitchen was not a crime scene, but a portal between consumption and salvation. In the 1970s, a psychologist named Dr. Miriam Klein revisited the case from a cognitive behavioral angle, arguing that Adler's ritualism reflected a form of grief-induced delusion. She could not save her unborn children, so she sought to feed others into eternity, preserving life through death. Klein's theory resonated with academics, framing Adler not as evil but as broken, a woman whose faith metastasized into madness. Yet even Klein admitted that some elements defied diagnosis. When she visited the Maple Hollow site in 1974, she described hearing cutlery clinking where no table stood and the rhythmic pulse of boiling water underground. She left the field entirely. 2 years later, after developing unexplained tremors in her hands, her final journal entry before her institutionalization reads, "The hunger speaks in heat. It only stops when you listen." Such notes blurred the line between researcher and witness, between science and surrender. By the 1980s, The story of the boarding house had evolved into a cultural myth. Filmmakers portrayed Adler as both monster and martyr, some depictions showing her as a witch invoking ancestral spirits, others as a grieving mother punished for her devotion. College theses examined her case as proto-feminist commentary on domestic confinement and patriarchal piety. Theologians cited her as a metaphor for corrupted communion. The more interpretations multiplied, the less the truth mattered. Tourists began visiting the overgrown lot each autumn, leaving bread on the foundation stones, whispering prayers, daring one another to taste the Adler air. In 1998, an amateur archaeologist claimed to have found a rusted ladle buried near the site, its handle engraved with the same triangular rune etched into the tools found decades before. Tests confirmed the metal dated back to the early 1900s, but its origin could not be traced. The ladle disappeared en route to the state archive. Later that year, a documentary crew recording B-roll audio near Maple Hollow captured a low-frequency hum between 17 and 19 hertz. Too low for the human ear, but capable of inducing nausea and unease. The director claimed the sound wave resembled a human heartbeat slowed to half speed. Geologists blamed it on shifting groundwater and trapped air pockets beneath the clay. Folklorists called it the house breathing. By 2005, urban explorers on online forums were sharing infrared footage of the site, faint heat blooms appearing in the soil where the furnace once stood, despite winter frost. They measured the temperature, always between 37 and 38 degrees Celsius, the warmth of a living body. Local authorities sealed off the property after multiple reports of trespassers collapsing from heat exhaustion and hallucination. Nothing was ever proven, but the legend gained digital immortality. Today, the Maple Hollow site is fenced off, though travelers still leave offerings through the wire: coins, bread crusts, candles. Drones hovering over the area have recorded shimmering distortions in the air, like waves rising from invisible fire. Scientists attribute it to thermal mirage. The faithful insist it's the echo of her kitchen, still cooking for those who dare to remember. The Adler hypothesis, as it's come to be called, now spans psychology, folklore, theology, and physics, a rare case that refuses to settle. Each field claims it, none owns it. For rationalists, the story is a cautionary tale about isolation, grief, and unchecked religious mania. For the superstitious, it's proof that hunger, spiritual or physical, can transcend death. In truth, perhaps both are correct. What drives a human being to transform nurture into annihilation? To turn the most sacred act, feeding, into ritual sacrifice? The case endures not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't. No bones, no blood, no closure. In that absence, imagination feasts. Each generation adds seasoning to the myth, turning history into metaphor, fear into folklore. The boarding house becomes whatever the era needs it to be. A story about contamination when disease spreads, about loneliness when society fractures, about faith when reason fails. The last verified document connected to the case dates to 1979, an unsigned letter sent to the Ohio Historical Society, written in spidery ink, reading only, "The recipe was never hers. She just kept the fire alive." The envelope contained a lock of gray hair and a flake of what appeared to be burned crust. Tests inconclusive. No fingerprints. After that, silence. Except for the occasional rumor of soft humming when the wind moves through the grass at dusk. Locals say if you stand still long enough, you'll feel warmth radiate from the ground, as though something beneath remembers being fed. Perhaps the most unsettling detail, however, came not from evidence but from repetition. Over time, every person who seriously investigated the Adler case, scientists, priests, journalists, reported dreams of the same thing: a long wooden table, empty chairs, and the smell of bread baking somewhere just out of sight. None could explain why. One journalist later remarked, "It's as if she invites you to dinner just to remind you she never left." Whether that's psychological contagion or something deeper remains unsolved. Maybe the boarding house's legacy isn't death at all, but transformation, the endless recycling of stories, turning terror into ritual, grief into meaning. Mrs. Adler's kitchen might be gone, but her hunger remains, reborn in every telling. The line between history and haunting grows thinner each year, and still, the question lingers like the scent of something cooking long after the fire's out. Did she feed them to survive? Or did she survive to feed? Whatever the answer, the ground beneath Maple Hollow continues to breathe. And if you press your ear against it on a windless night, you might swear you hear a whisper rising from below, soft and steady, asking only one thing: Are you hungry? The boarding house no longer stands, only a rectangle of scorched soil and the faint trace of a foundation, now overgrown with dandelions and wild mint. Yet the story of Mrs. Margaret Adler endures, fermenting in the imagination of anyone who dares to ask where kindness ends and appetite begins. Time has buried her kitchen, but not the hunger that lingered inside it. Every few years, another writer, historian, or ghost hunter arrives in Maple Hollow, drawn by the same invisible scent, something between broth and decay, warmth and warning. The townspeople tolerate them the way one tolerates bad weather. They've learned not to disturb the ground, not to whisper her name near dusk, and certainly not to light a stove on the anniversary of her death. They say that's when the air thickens, when the smell of yeast becomes suffocating, when a strange warmth rises from the dirt like the house itself is remembering how to breathe. The legend endures because it feeds a deeper hunger, our fascination with goodness turned rancid, with nurture that curdles into horror. Mrs. Adler was supposed to be a healer, a caretaker, a woman of prayer. Yet somewhere between devotion and despair, something inside her cracked. The theories only deepen the mystery. Was she a murderer masking madness with mercy? A saint attempting to save souls through forbidden ritual? Or a lonely widow who mistook hunger for holiness? Each explanation satisfies for a moment, then crumbles under its own weight, like bread left too long in the oven. The truth refuses to rise because perhaps it was never meant to. Perhaps the real contagion was grief, passed down from one generation to the next, a recipe no one dares to forget. Even today, locals swear that when storms roll through Maple Hollow, the rain tastes faintly of broth. Travelers have described the peculiar warmth of the soil beneath their boots and the echo of something like a heartbeat pulsing underfoot. Scientists chalk it up to geothermal activity. Priests call it the soul's unrest. Somewhere between those extremes lies the space where this story still lives. Historians test soil samples. Priests bless the ground. Psychologists debate the nature of her mind, but none can explain why the hunger never ends. And maybe that's the final lesson of Maple Hollow. The meal was never meant to feed the body. It was meant to feed the story. Mrs. Adler's kitchen became a mirror of our own appetites, the way we consume tragedy to feel empathy, horror to feel safe, evil to feel moral. Every retelling becomes another bite, another taste of something that refuses to cool. The fire went out a century ago, but the warmth remains, patient and waiting. Somewhere beneath the roots and rubble, the house still hums softly, as if simmering in remembrance. And if you listen closely enough, past the wind and the rain, you might hear her voice tender and low, asking the same question that has haunted Maple Hollow for more than 100 years. Are you still hungry?